Welcome to the NAEYC Black Caucus Writing Workshop webinar for mentees. We're going to introduce our facilitator for this evening, Kyra Ostendorf. Since January 2019, Kyra Ostendorf has served as publisher at Free Spirit Publishing. She oversees the day-to-day operations of the company and supports its mission to meet kids' social, emotional, and educational needs. Prior to joining Free Spirit, Kyra was the Vice President of Education at Kaplan Early Learning Company, where she managed the editorial and production work for Connect for Learning, a comprehensive pre-kindergarten curriculum. She was also the acquiring editor at Red Leaf Press. Kyra has served on the board of the Minnesota Association for the Education of Young Children and the Minnesota School Age Care Alliance, and was a member of the National Association for Education of Young Children's Affiliate Council's Executive Committee. Kyra holds a master's in education in early childhood from the University of Minnesota and a BA from Macalester College.
So the invitation and kind of the way I've structured this time together is to talk about kind of my insights and experience from working with a lot of different authors on the what, why, who, where, when, and how of writing. And if you think back to like what it means to be a journalist, those are the 5 W's, I guess. And so it felt like a good way to structure the conversation and to give some tips. Talk through some possible scenarios and ideas of things that you might already be thinking of. We do have some homework and a way to move this forward so that we can, you can actually do some writing and have a chance to have a review and back and forth. And so we'll talk about that. And then have time to wrap up and any other remaining questions. So that's the plan for this next time together. And go to the next slide. So the first question, I think it seems to be a good place to start. What will you write? And when I was the acquiring editor at Red Leaf Press, people would come up to me at an NAEYC conference in the booth and they'd say, "You're the acquiring editor, I want to write a book." And I'd say, "Cool, what do you want to write about?" And they, "Well, what do you need?" And I'd say, "Nope, that's not the way this works." You need to know what you want to write about, because writing is a lot of work, and it's something that has to come from your own expertise. So when you think about what will you write, those are the questions I would ask you to ask yourself. What is your expertise? What are you passionate about? What do you have to share with the world? And we'll talk about audience in a minute. But so identify your topic, and it can be a lot of different things, and we all have a variety of expertises. So think about, what perspective you bring, what's new to maybe a conversation, or thinking about what you know and what you want to share. So that's kind of step one. What do you want to write? What will you write? And then what will it look like? What in terms of format? So if you have something in mind already, if you're submitting to a journal, or if this is a letter or an article or a blog post, or is it a book? Do you have a book in you? So depending on what you're going to write, impacts kind of the rest of how we put this together. The format includes the word count range, right? So obviously an article is longer than a blog post, but a book obviously is a lot longer than any of that. So just kind of knowing, not that one can't inform the other. Like you could start with an article and then that could become a book. That happens, but have a starting place. Have a goal for this, especially for this writing assignment that we're going to kind of give to everyone tonight. So my recommendation would be not to write a book for this next summer homework assignment, but if you have a book in you, I'm absolutely happy to have that conversation. So identify what you will write, the topic, the format. Maybe you have your local affiliate, or your NAEYC affiliate is, from what I know, they're often very happy to receive submissions for newsletters and such. So again, just depending on who your audience is, what you will be writing, informs word count range, and connecting all of that with the topic. Next slide. So why will you write? So you have a what, you have a passion, you have an expertise to share. Think about that in connection to why it's needed. What is the problem or issue you're trying to solve or address? If it's a parent newsletter, if it's a letter to the editor of your local paper, if it's a journal article, if it's a book, like what do you want people to learn from writing what you write, from reading what you write? Sorry, I think I just said writing twice. And so thinking of it in terms of, I'll give this example. People, again, as an acquiring editor at Red Leaf, would often get submissions where someone's passion is what works for them in the classroom. They love puppets, or they love cooking with children, and it works for them. They're able to take that passion and expertise and apply it in ways that are very successful for them and the children they work with. It's not necessarily something that solves a problem or addresses an issue that other people can learn from. So maybe you find another puppeteer who you can collaborate with and share ideas, but it's not necessarily something to write about, if that makes sense. And I'm happy to pause in a minute and take questions, so it's like asking yourself, how does my expertise connect to a problem or an issue that I want to address? And what will the reader know or be able to do after reading what I've written? So connecting all of that, and I will pause here because I don't want to go too fast through this. These are kind of the core of the important pieces of starting with this. So those of you able to join on audio or in the chat room, if you want to share, maybe you already have an idea, you're here tonight, you've been thinking about writing, or maybe you've already started writing. Does this fit with what you've been thinking? Do you have questions?
Yes, my name is Hope. Can you hear me?
Sure can. Hi, Hope.
Hi. I have a problem with getting my thoughts on paper so that people can actually understand what it is I'm talking about. I speak that way too as well. So when you asked about the what, I wrote that down. And why, I wrote that down. But my goal and my purpose is to be intentional about my writing skills so that whoever is reading what I wrote would actually understand what it is I'm trying to say. Do you understand me?
I think I'm going to ask to pause and table that, because I will be talking about kind of audience and the how. Like,
okay, that's fine.
Make sure I come back to it if I don't answer it in a few more slides. But
okay.
If you have your what and your why, I think that's kind of a really, that's for me the most important starting place.
Okay.
Knowing that writing takes time and thought, having that what and why is your foundation
Okay.
Anyone else on this particular point, and then I'll keep moving because I think I will answer your question in a minute.
Okay.
Okay.
No questions. I have lots of topics. It's just narrowing it down to which one.
Okay. So thinking about the what and why in terms of narrowing topics, my recommendation is to think about either how they connect or how they're very distinct from each other, and then what else is already out there in the marketplace, so to speak. So what the why of what you write should be something new if you're presenting it to a large audience, right? And so in the sense of a journal article or a book for the market. And I am is probably my favorite part, Kelly, of helping authors, is to hear those different ideas and connect them or separate them out. Like sometimes ideas can be different books, and sometimes ideas overlap enough that they become chapters of one book. So we can talk.
Okay, we will.
Anything else in the moment from anyone? Okay, next slide. So this piece of audience is connected to the what, right? So if you're writing a journal article, which is your what, knowing who your audience is. If it's a journal article for TYC or for young children, those are slightly different audiences. If you're writing for your affiliate newsletter, again, a slightly different audience. So being really focused on who your audience is and how that informs the tone, the vocabulary you use if you're writing to new parents or younger parents, if you're writing to first-year teachers, right? So depending on who your audience is, can change how you write, what you write. Keeping it, again, long, short vocabulary, and being able to connect the who to the why of answering that question or helping someone learn something. So making sure that's a through thread that connects. So a letter to the editor of your local newspaper on an early childhood advocacy kind of topic. There's specific word counts. There's a specific, look at other letters that have been published to get the sense of style and tone that I heartily recommend, reading other pieces that have been published in the format or in the same publication that you want to be published in, because that will help you know what their approach is, what they like to cover, how they, that tone and style, obviously, as well as audience. Next slide. So this is when I was talking with Jerry and getting ready for tonight, and kind of the when, where, and how that I'm going to talk about next. We had fun thinking about this because it is something that I hear from authors quite often of, you have to be intentional about these. You have to, I would encourage you to have a plan for where, when, and we'll talk about how in a minute, but what time can you dedicate? I know authors who write every morning a certain amount of 100, 600 words or whatever it is. They'll write every day, kind of just to maintain that discipline and to it doesn't necessarily end up in something that's published, but it's part of who they are, if you will. And then I've worked with authors who book a cabin in the woods or go to a friend's house who's out of town and have time alone for 3 days and just kind of pour it out in a pretty intense, I would think of as intense writing period. So think about how you work best. Is it in the morning? Is it at night? Is it at home? Is it at the library? Like, identify where and when you will write, because that's part of being intentional, having a plan that can hopefully lead to success. So the is your kitchen table the right spot? Do you need to, like I said, go to the library or a coffee shop? Do you like background noise? Do you need it quiet? Do you need your resource books in front of you? Like, just give some thought to that so it's part of your plan. Next slide. So this is the how, and truly, like, logistically how. Like, some people might actually like, especially if you're not writing a book, I do not recommend writing on paper, pen and paper, if you're writing a book. But if you're writing a letter or an article or a newsletter piece, like, you could write it on paper, and that can be a nice way to connect with your words and in the space and time that allows you to be more portable and to kind of write in the moment and then later transfer it to the computer. Hope you, part of what occurs to me in your question about communicating words, that it can sometimes be really helpful to dictate. I think there are free, like, software programs where you can talk into the microphone and it will capture, right? And the software is getting better and better to capture your thoughts and ideas into a Word program, and then go back and kind of clean it up and to smooth it out a little bit. But sometimes, again, depending on the audience and the tone of the piece, that conversational way of talking can actually be really appealing, even in written form. So think about that, again, looking at kind of where you want to be published, and if that's an acceptable kind of tone, if you will, that more conversational style. It can also be a really good way to capture your ideas and just kind of have that free flow of without, for me as a writer, and I don't write very often, but when I do write, that blank screen is the hardest piece. And if I can get past that, then I can keep going. So having the dictation software to capture those initial ideas, for me, can be really helpful. Like, just put it out there first, and then I can kind of go back and think more about it. So depending on what your preferences are and how intimidating or not intimidating that first blank screen is, if you work on paper, it will eventually need to be transferred into a Word file. If you use dictation software, you do absolutely need to go back and read through it, clean it up, make sure it's saying what you want it to say. So Hope, I'm not sure if that exactly answered your question. I think in terms of communicating messages, it might help to have an outline. It might help to have a really clear, kind of back to our high school English classes, it might be, a thesis statement, like, here's my intent. Here's the message I'm trying to communicate. And then, yeah.
And I'm following you and writing the notes as you speak. So I'm getting there.
Sure. Having that kind of thesis statement of here's here's the issue that I'm addressing. Here's my thoughts on it. Here's my concern. Here's my solution, depending on, what you're talking about. And then, rather than like a big formal outline, because an article doesn't necessarily need a big outline, but, jot down the 3 or 4 bullet points that are the key ideas behind that main thesis. And then those become your paragraphs, so that it flows and, you're not repeating yourself. That different than when, like, if you've given a presentation at a conference and whatnot, kind of the 101s I'm presenting, tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? And you don't necessarily have to do that in an article or in a written piece, because it's all right there. People can go back and read it. So, if they didn't understand a paragraph, it's still there, and they can go back and read it again for clarity. So it's different in that way. And so if you do have a conversational style in your writing, you have to be careful that it's not repetitive. And on the risk of repeating myself, I will just pause and take any additional questions or thoughts. Or
Kyra, this is Jerry, and I wonder if you would maybe hammer away a little more on audience, because sometimes I think it was a real breakthrough for me as well, when I was an academic, as well as when I was a center director, to really think about who this message was for, and even down to, we used to occasionally do newsletters at the center. And on the one hand, I hated doing it. But on the other hand, it did give me a chance to address issues that either, perhaps I was freaked out about and wanted to get across to parents. So one example, we were in a building that there was a long way to the front door. There were other things going on in this building. It was an academic building. And parents of children from, 3, 4, and 5 enjoyed the autonomy that their kids were developing and loved to have them take off down the hall running. Well, the problem was the front door, the glass doors to this building were not always closed. Sometimes they were open, and they opened onto a street. And I was properly freaked out about that and passionate about it, but trying to figure out a way to talk to parents about it, so that they could hear me and didn't feel like I was beating them up about it. So I think, there's this audience, and then there's what you want to say forcefully, and yet are people going to hear it? And so if you just kind of talk a little bit about the nuance of audience, parents and otherwise.
Mm-hmm. I think in writing today, like, I'm going to go down the path of, people don't have a lot of time, and they want to know that what they're going to be reading is important or informative, or and so sometimes that comes down to headline and having that kind of catchy, without being alarming, to get people's attention, right? And so, and then the other piece of that is bulleted lists, things that having a paragraph of text and then being able to have ideas in ways that people can kind of glance at things without having to necessarily read all of it. But that's less about audience and more just kind of general, making the written word appealing on the page, which is not necessarily the job of the writer. Like, some of that has to do with the format of and what the publisher does with the words. But more to your point, and question about audience, I think if Kelly, if I may, like when you have lots of ideas, and that's part of the question of thinking about, you know, how are they ideas for the same audience? Do they go together? Maybe your scenario, Jerry, of kids running down the hallway is part of a bigger article about safety at school, and that one kind of concern is an example among others, that so you're not pointing people out, you know, you're not calling them out so that they feel, you know, that they're being attacked or whatever. And so thinking of it in terms of how the audience will receive your message and what it means to them in the context of, you know, the safety of their child, or you know, something that they should be learning from your perspective. So does that help? Does that get to what you were hoping I would do?
Yes, that was helpful, Kyra.
Somebody's whistling. It has a bird. Or it's outside, maybe. It's very sweet. So in lots of ways, you know, this webinar is abstract because I'm thinking of possibilities, but I'm happy to take specifics. You know, if you have something that you'd like to talk about, otherwise the next slide Lark has to share is just as scenarios, because I've got a few that I kind of, you know, thought up in the interest of sharing ideas. But if you have a specific scenario that you're looking to write, you know, something, we can talk about that. Otherwise, I was going to talk about like the different things to think about for a newsletter, or you know, your school, your own community kind of newsletter versus a policy paper. So I had like kind of a few different categories, if that makes sense. Sound okay?
Yes.
So for me, thinking of kind of three different audiences, three different types of publications, it was the early childhood education community audience. So that could be an NAEYC journal article, it could be an early childhood education blog, it could be your NAEYC affiliate newsletter. So, right, you're talking to your colleagues in early childhood ed. So on that path, my recommendations are to find out about upcoming themes and topics that those publications have in the pipeline. They often have things related either to a conference or to specific topics in the field. So finding out their upcoming themes and topics, identifying deadlines associated with those topics, and often a word count range that they'll want, you know, between, I don't know, I'm making it up, 700 and 1,000 words. Don't quote me, look it up. So finding that out, I would say with those publications, you don't need to worry about graphics or photos unless you have something that is absolutely specific to what you're writing. So if you're writing about children doing a specific type of project, or if you're writing about you know, something that happened in your classroom, you might actually want to have photos of that particular event. And if you have photos of children, you need to have releases from their parents, and so there are, you know, there's some things required there. So generally speaking, you know, certainly you don't need to have any illustrations. If there's a graph, that would be helpful. You don't have to have that done and perfect. You just need to kind of know that you need it and say that it would be helpful. Those are what I imagined what you would want to know in terms of writing for a newsletter or a journal. The other audience and kind of publication, if you will, was what we've talked about in terms of a school newsletter, a communication to families and maybe even the greater community around your school. There are topics and questions that multiple families would benefit from, right? So thinking about how to put that, maybe that one issue into a bigger context that can appeal to more families, that will get everybody reading about it. Is there an invitation that can be part of that article? So that, is there a follow-up of conversation, or and think too about timeliness of being current on what topics you're covering in your newsletter at what point in the year, right? So is it transition to kindergarten that's coming up, or is it a specific child development topic? Montessori school that my kids go to, the newsletter editor has done a great job of sharing kind of the research and thinking and teaching of Maria Montessori through that parent newsletter. So, ways to share information with your community. Lots of times these are delivered online as a e-news piece, and sometimes word count isn't as precise. It doesn't have to be as short, although you still want to be careful not to be too long. The third writing and publication platform that I thought folks might be interested in is more the policy paper or letters to the editor, where you're really taking on something that's more political, something that's impactful for the field, but also the community, society, if you will, at large. And so you're going to want to have current research. You're going to want to be able to probably cite some statistics, make sure they're current, make sure you're giving those citations accurately and giving credit where credit is due to other authors and researchers. Sometimes that means putting things together, like taking different research and data and looking at them together in a new way that can be really informative and helpful for either, again, maybe it's still the field as an audience, but it's more academic type policy approach than it is a conversational piece. So those are the three that I was thinking of that folks might be wanting to consider. If I missed one or there's something else that you'd like to ask about, I'm happy to take questions.
Even though I'm part of NAEYC, I just wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to know, when you're doing op-eds and things like that, something that I sometimes do is, like, I'll look and see if a researcher has a lot of followers. Mm-hmm. So when you quote the researcher, is that okay? Do you view that as something that you should do, that like best practices? Is that kind of like, are you cheating when you're doing that? Like, what do you think?
So my rule of thumb is you want to be current, and you also don't need to cite something that is essentially common knowledge. So if you're without a specific example, it's hard to know exactly on that. But I think there's some, and if it's controversial, if it's not agreed upon common knowledge, if it's still controversial in the field, then you absolutely should cite it, because you want to kind of have that backup, and citing someone who's well followed, or I would assume that also means well respected, but maybe not, is perfectly great. And I think you have to, my only caution in the moment would be that your whole writing piece is not citations of other people, right? You need to bring your own perspective, your own interpretation, your own ideas, your own way of connecting things to what you write. So otherwise it's just a paper for, you know, a class that you took in college or something like that. Like, it's not what you want to write. What I think the purpose of this webinar is to help people write something that's, you know, out there for a different audience than, you know, your own writing, or for a class. Which isn't to say that something you wrote in a class can't be kind of tweaked and you know, put out there into something that's meant for other people. But again, it comes down to audience. Like what a professor wants to read for a class paper is probably different than what, you know, your colleagues want to read in terms of your thinking.
Even like something that's online would be different than something that's like for print. They're going to have a different way they're looking at things. There's something like, well, we need something, but you have to be like online friendly. So.
Exactly. Yep. And if you all saw the blog I wrote for Free Spirit a few weeks ago that Lark included in her email at the end of last week, that was the first time I've ever written a blog. And so, you know, it was exactly that. It was like, it has to be short. It has to have links to other resources. So yes, knowing what the platform is and looking at how it's used from other authors and contributors is really important. And I'll tell that to people if I think somebody has a good idea that comes through acquisitions, and it's not a good fit for our line, whether this was at Red Leaf or now at Free Spirit, I will go back to the author and say, you've got a pretty good idea. It's not for us to publish. You need to go to your library or your bookstore, really, you know, good bookstore, probably better than the library. Go to a good bookstore and find similar types of books. See who's publishing those. Make sure they don't have anything exactly like what you want to do, but similar enough that they're going to be interested in your idea. That's really important.
I have one more question. I'm so sorry, and I don't want to monopolize anybody's time, but how do you deal with rejections? Like, say someone tells you no, like, should you be snarky? No, just kidding. What should you do? Because you're a book editor, you're an editor. When someone tells you no, what do you do? Like, should you be hurt? Should you expect it? Like, what should happen? Because I know, like, you know, this is a writing workshop. You put your work out there, you spend all this time, and you give it to somebody, and they're like, no. What do you do at this point?
Depending on what you've written, and depending on, so if there's interest, but it's not quite there, usually an editor will want to have that conversation. Like, really appreciate this perspective, but this other part that you wrote about, you know, we already have that, or we don't see the connection, or you wrote this for parents, we'd really like it for educators, or, right? So there's ways that an editor can provide opportunities with a slightly different direction. And I think because our field is needs the perspective and voices of especially Black educators, that any editor worth their salt is going to be able to have that conversation, or at least be able to encourage kind of future opportunity. So, but sometimes rejection happens, and I've been in those moments where it's like, gosh, I really want this to work, and I'm not the only one making the decision, right? I mean, and so sales and marketing weighs in. Our business person, when we're talking about books, because publishers invest thousands of dollars into the publication of a book, and so, you know, there are a lot of perspectives and considerations that have to be taken into account when a book publisher is saying yes or no to a book idea. So I think book publishing is slightly, I mean, I didn't really talk a lot about that tonight. And if there's interest in that, I think we should probably, schedule another webinar, or I can meet with people at PLI if you're going to be there. So doing your homework ahead of time, knowing for journal articles and even for books, what are they looking to publish about, and what have they already published? Certainly with book submissions, you need to present, like, how is this different than what else is out there on the market? Because we need the author to do some of that homework for us to really say, here's what I bring. And I think it's something to think about, even for journal articles and the other things that we've been talking about tonight.
So, Kyra, this is Jerry again. I just, when I'm thinking about writing and how it's hard to, even when it's something you're excited about, to kind of get it down and keep plugging away. I would really suggest that people, if you find yourself having to stretch too far to come up with what to put on paper, then maybe you don't know enough about that idea yet to write it. There are things that in your everyday work that often I think we kind of just skip over. Well, everybody does that. Everybody knows that. But they don't, and we kind of aim for the stars, when in reality, right here at this picnic table, there's all kind of juicy stuff that you could write about, from your cultural perspective, from your practice perspective, linking it with some of the literature. So, Lark, you were talking about, what about somebody whose work has been in the news and you quote them? Well, Lord have mercy, I forgot the man's name. At Harvard, writers about expulsion. Boy, that's terrible. I can't think of his name, but you know who I mean.
Walter Gilliam.
Thank you. So Walter's written a lot about and gotten a lot of publicity about expulsion. Well, I think it's perfectly legitimate from the perspective of your program or an experience you had with your child or a relative or whatever. What does expulsion look like right there where you sit, where your bucket is dropped, and what kinds of things do you see going on? Are you making go on? Or the conversations that the staff is having around making sure that doesn't happen? There's so many facets to expulsion that, I'll bet everybody on this call has some version of the expulsion story they could write about that would make expulsion real for people. Does that make sense? And therefore it would be worth writing about in a blog or whatever, a staff newsletter or an affiliate newsletter even. Kelly, you were talking about being an affiliate leader. I mean, what's going on in your community about expulsion? Are you guys one of the terrible statistics? And, could that be something in an affiliate newsletter? You could say, wow, guys, we need to fix this. Let's, and give people some action plan to do about it. I just think that sometimes we put a burden on ourselves about writing because we're trying to cure every single ill in the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we just brought it closer to home, we've got a lot that we could say and say it fluently to whatever audiences we're trying to reach. And in that way, we kind of build our confidence and can then, write bigger and bigger, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Which, thank you for that, Jerry, because I think it fits back to where we started. What will you write? You have to write from what you know, and to make those connections, to make it meaningful to your readers, is everything, really. Is everything. So I think that's a nice transition to our homework. If you want to go to the next slide, please. The next one has the actual kind of outline. The what we've proposed, and this can be a fluid timeline of sorts, but if you haven't already, to identify your who, what, when, why, where, and how, to write, revise, and then to write, review, and revise. So that is to say that it doesn't have to be perfect, but you need to sometimes put it down and then go back and look at it and read it again. Are there points that you want to clarify? Are there things that are redundant? Are there words that are used 5 times in the same paragraph? Switch those. So find the things that, just to help you kind of craft something that's a little bit better than what you wrote the first time. So write, review, revise, and then it will, we're going to pair you up. So Lark in the next few weeks, and Megan, maybe, I'm not sure. People are going to identify kind of who's participating in this process, and probably in addition to those on the webinar tonight, people that will have opportunity to watch the recording. And we're going to peer review your writings. And so I provided, Lark has it to email out to everyone. It's just like 2 or 3 questions so that your peer review has a sense of the what and the who, right? So, is this a blog? Is this a newsletter? Is it a journal article? Is it, right? So that you kind of lay out that intent for your peer review. And then, and you a little bit asking kind of your expertise to it. What do you bring? Which may or may not be part of what you actually write. Sometimes it's really helpful for the reader to know how you come to this writing. Sometimes it's not necessary, so it depends. So there'll be a peer review time, and then and we'll have a kind of a form to fill out. So that the idea is not that peer review is doing a line edit necessarily, but just providing some general feedback. And then you as the writer will have time to take that in, incorporate it how you want to. And then the idea here then is that it will come to me, and I'll have an opportunity to work directly with you and provide some feedback and direction. And then you're on your own to submit it for publication or self-publish or however you would proceed. So that's kind of what Jerry and I had talked about as an opportunity to both support and nudge this process. Hopefully it feels that way. It feels supportive and nudging. I know that authors need deadlines. So having that and being true to those opportunity, it keeps everything moving forward. So we'll be in touch, but we can start this process and aim to have a kind of complete draft ready in June or July. Sound good?
I just would like to, this is Jerry again, I'd just like to underscore that there's no way to do this but to get started. And don't be gun shy, just commit something to paper, whether you use a quill pen or your computer or whatever, commit something to paper. And I'd just like to remind you that, little kids, 3 and 4-year-olds, do something called a writer's workshop, where they put their sentences down and their crooked letters and their upside down stuff, and they put it down and they hand it to another child, and they sit in a circle and they talk about what's written. And it's because the child reading the writing gets to ask questions, what do you mean, that the first child's writing gets better. And so this is just an adult version of what little kids can do. And if you won't be gun shy and will just put yourself out there, this is how you're going to get over the hump.
Yes, it is.
And I'm going to talk about you if you don't write.
That's enough motivation. I will be writing.
I will be at PLI in the beginning of June, and am happy to set up appointments. It could, sometimes 15 minutes is all it takes, and other times, if you want to sit and talk for 45 minutes, I'm good with that too. So I'm happy to. I think I was on the email, or Lark or Megan, they all have my email address. It's KYRAKLC. Put it in the chat at iCloud.com. That's my personal professional email. I can also be found at Ostendorf at Free Spirit, but I think it's for this purpose, it's best to find me on the iCloud address. So yes, absolutely happy to meet with folks in Long Beach if you're going to be there. Set up a phone call separately from this. If you're feeling stuck, don't hesitate to reach out to either me or a colleague on the webinar with us, or your mentor. They are all resources for you. So I think that's it. Are there any other questions or concerns? We are at our hour.
Nope. This was very helpful.
Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll be in touch, and you all start writing.
All right, we will.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.